The water in the Atchafalaya Basin doesn't flow. It stagnates. It sits heavy and thick beneath a canopy of bald cypress trees, collecting the silt of the Mississippi and the secrets of the families who have owned this land for 2 centuries. In the daylight, the bayou is a place of savage beauty, all green light and hanging Spanish moss. But at night, specifically on the night of October 31st, 1958, the beauty rots. The humidity rises until the air feels less like oxygen and more like a wet wool blanket pressed against your face. It was on this night, under a moon obscured by low-hanging storm clouds, that the silence of the swamp was broken not by the cry of a heron, but by the sound of silk tearing against cypress knees. To understand the horror of what happened in Vermilion Parish, you have to understand the geography of isolation. This wasn't a place you passed through on your way to somewhere else. It was the end of the line, a labyrinth of waterways and levees, where the only law enforcement was the distance between neighbors and the depth of the mud. And deep in the heart of this labyrinth, miles from the nearest paved road, a solitary figure was navigating a flat-bottomed skiff through the black water. His name was Bo Landry, a man who made his living pulling alligator skins and crawfish from the muck. He knew the swamp better than he knew the streets of New Orleans. He knew the sounds of the water. He knew that a splash at midnight usually meant a gator rolling or a nutria rat slipping from a log. But what he heard that night was different. It was a gasp, a wet, desperate intake of breath that didn't belong to any animal native to this parish. Bo cut the engine. The silence rushed back in, deafening in its intensity. He grabbed his spotlight, a heavy, rusted beam connected to a car battery, and swept it across the darkness. The light cut through the mist, illuminating the skeletal roots of the trees, the black, oil-slick surface of the water, and then something white. It was floating, snagged on a submerged log near a small, nameless island. At first, Bo thought it was a parachute, or perhaps a ghost, given the date. But as he drifted closer, the shape resolved into something far more terrifying. It was a ball gown, yards of expensive white chantilly lace, sodden and stained with algae, billowing out in the water like a drowning flower. And in the center of that white cloud was a girl. She was clinging to the cypress root with fingers that had been stripped raw. Her face was turned upward, pale as the moon should have been, her eyes wide and fixed on nothing. She couldn't have been more than 17, but the details that made Bo Landry's blood turn to ice weren't the scratches on her arms or the bruise darkening her jawline. It was the contrast. Here, in the middle of the most inhospitable wilderness in America, surrounded by cottonmouths and alligators, this girl was wearing a diamond necklace that caught the beam of the spotlight with a blinding, mocking brilliance. She was a vision of high society dropped into a primal hell. She was barefoot, her feet cut to ribbons, but her neck was adorned with enough wealth to buy Bo's entire shack 3 times over. He pulled her into the boat. She didn't scream. She didn't speak. She just shivered, a violent, rattling convulsion that shook the small craft. When he wrapped his canvas coat around her, she flinched, not as if she were cold, but as if she expected the fabric to burn her. Bo didn't have a radio. He gunned the engine and raced back toward the landing, a 30-minute run through the twisting channels. When he finally reached the dock, the only light came from the neon sign of a bait shop and the headlights of a single patrol car parked near the levee. Sheriff Earl Broussard was leaning against the hood, smoking a cigarette, as if he had been waiting. This is where the story should have followed the standard procedure. An ambulance should have been called, a report filed. A frantic search for parents initiated, but in Vermilion Parish in 1958, the standard procedure was whatever Sheriff Broussard said it was. Bo Landry carried the girl up the wooden ramp, her white dress dripping swamp water onto the dusty gravel. He expected the sheriff to rush forward to ask who she was, to call for the doctor. Instead, Sheriff Broussard didn't even flick his cigarette away. He looked at the girl, at the diamonds, at the lace, at the terror etched into her catatonic face. And he didn't look surprised. He looked annoyed. He walked to his cruiser, opened the back door, and gestured for Bo to put her inside. There was no radio call to dispatch. There was no siren. Broussard walked over to a payphone attached to the side of the bait shop, dropped a dime in, and dialed a number that wasn't the hospital. Bo Landry, standing there with the smell of the girl's expensive perfume mixing with the stench of the swamp on his hands, heard the sheriff say only one sentence before hanging up. One of the mockingbirds got out. "I'm bringing her back to the nest." That phrase, bringing her back, is the key. It implies she belonged somewhere. It implies that her presence in the swamp wasn't an accident, but an escape. And it implies that the sheriff knew exactly whose cage she had broken out of. The girl in the back seat was named Elara Vance. And she wasn't just a lost teenager, she was the property of the most exclusive and the most depraved institution the South had ever concealed. To understand how Elara ended up in that water, we have to peel back the layers of Louisiana society like the skin of an onion. In 1958, the world was changing. Rock and roll was on the radio, the civil rights movement was gaining momentum, and the rigid structures of the Old South were beginning to crack. But in the drawing rooms of the Garden District in New Orleans and the plantation homes along the River Road, time stood still. These were the families of the bloodline, the Moyle Barons, the Sugar Kings, the political dynasties who believed that their name was a currency more valuable than gold. For these families, appearance was everything. A daughter was not just a child, she was an asset. She was a future alliance, a merger to be negotiated at a debutante ball. She was expected to be chaste, obedient, and decorative. But Elara Vance was a problem. Her father, Clayton Vance, was a man who had made a fortune in offshore drilling. He was loud, new money trying desperately to look like old money. He bought the biggest house, joined the most exclusive clubs, and expected his daughter to be the crown jewel of his ascent. Elara was different. She read books that weren't assigned in school. She asked questions at dinner parties that made the wives gasp and the husbands glare. And, unforgivably, she fell in love. Not with the son of a senator or a banker, but with a boy named Jesse, a mechanic who worked at a garage in the French Quarter. He had grease under his fingernails and a smile that made Elara feel, for the first time in her life, like a human being rather than a porcelain doll. The discovery of their relationship wasn't dramatic in the way movies are. There was no shouting match. There was just a cold, terrifying silence. Elara came home one afternoon to find her father sitting in the library, a stack of letters on his desk, letters she had written to Jesse. He didn't look at her. He just tapped the ash from his cigar and said, "You're broken, Elara, but you can be fixed." 2 days later, she was told she was going to a finishing school, a special academy in the country highly recommended by the governor himself. It was called Belle Reve. Beautiful dream. The brochure showed a sprawling antebellum mansion surrounded by azaleas, with girls in white dresses painting on easels by a lake. It promised refinement, restoration, and a return to the values of Southern womanhood. Elara fought. She screamed. She tried to call Jesse, but the phone lines in the house had been cut. She was sedated by the family doctor, a man who had delivered her as a baby, who stuck a needle in her arm with a look of professional pity. When she woke up, she was in the back of a black limousine, watching the city fade away, replaced by the endless suffocating green of the Atchafalaya. The car didn't stop at a school. It stopped at a gate. A massive structure of wrought iron choked with rust and trumpet vines, rising out of the mist like the jaws of a beast. There was no sign that said Belle Reve. There was only a guard booth manned by a man with a shotgun who nodded at the driver and cranked the mechanism to open the path. As the limousine rolled up the driveway, crushed shells crunching under the tires, Elara saw the house. It was magnificent and monstrous. A Greek revival giant with peeling white paint that looked like dead skin. The columns were thick as ancient oaks, and the windows were dark, staring out like empty eye sockets. This was the domain of Judge Julian LeBlanc. If the devil went down to Georgia, he stopped in Louisiana first to get instructions from Judge LeBlanc. At 60 years old, LeBlanc was the king of the swamp. He was a man who wore white linen suits in the dead of summer and never sweat. He had a voice like molasses, sweet, slow, encoding everything it touched. In public, he was a pillar of the community, a defender of segregation and states' rights. In private, he was the architect of a nightmare. LeBlanc believed that the modern world was ruining women. He believed that independence was a disease. And he had built Belle Reve not as a school, but as a quarantine facility. He didn't take tuition, he took favors. The fathers who sent their daughters here were the powerful men of the state, senators, judges, CEOs. They sent their problem girls to LeBlanc, and in return, LeBlanc gained leverage. He held the secrets of the most powerful men in the South. Elara was pulled from the car by two matrons. They weren't the kindly headmistresses from the brochure. They were strong, silent women with forearms like dock workers. They dragged her up the steps, past the grand portico, and into the foyer. The air inside was cooler than the swamp, but it smelled wrong. It didn't smell like floor wax or old books. It smelled of gardenias, heavily layered to cover the scent of something medicinal. Standing at the bottom of the grand staircase was Madame Delphine. She was the warden of this gilded prison, a tall, severe woman with hair pulled back so tight it pulled the skin of her face taut. She wore a high-collared black dress and a string of pearls that looked like teeth. She didn't smile. She walked up to Ilara, lifted her chin with a cold finger, and inspected her face. "You have spirit in your eyes," Madame Delphine said softly. "We will wash that out." "I want to call my father," Ilara said, trying to keep her voice from shaking. "This is a mistake." "Your father is the one who paid for the lock, child," Delphine replied. "There are no phones here. There are no letters. There is no Ilara. That name is gone. It was a name associated with sin and disobedience." Delphine turned to the matrons. "Take her to the nursery, clean her, and give her the tonic. From now on, she is Magnolia. She is beautiful, she is silent, and she blooms only when told." The nursery was on the 3rd floor. It was a row of rooms that looked like cells dressed up as boudoir. Pink wallpaper, canopy beds, antique dolls on the shelves. But the windows were nailed shut, the doors locked from the outside, and the tonic was a heavy dose of laudanum and barbiturates mixed into sweet tea. For the first week, Ilara, now Magnolia, lived in a haze. The drug made the edges of the world soft. It made the fear distant. She would wake up, be dressed by the silent matrons, and led to the classrooms. But the lessons were bizarre. There were no history books, no literature. Instead, they were taught how to walk with a book on their head for hours, how to pour wine without spilling a drop while a man shouted insults at them, how to sit perfectly still on a velvet chair for an entire afternoon, smiling until their jaw muscles spasmed. A lady is a reflection, Madame Delphine would lecture, pacing the room with a cane. She reflects the desires of the room. She does not project her own. You are not here to think. You are here to please. It was a systematic dismantling of the self. They took away her clothes and replaced them with white muslin dresses. They took away her jewelry and gave her a silver locket with the school's crest. They took away her history. If a girl mentioned her life before, her boyfriend, her school, her mother, she was sent to the quiet room in the basement. Ilara went to the quiet room once. She had refused to drink the tonic. The matrons dragged her down 3 flights of stairs, past the kitchen, past the wine cellar, to a damp, stone-walled chamber that smelled of earth and old fear. They left her there for 2 days in total darkness. No food, just water, and the sound of the swamp seeping through the walls, the sound of things scratching. When she came out, she drank the tonic. She learned the lesson. Resistance is pain. Compliance is comfort. But the drugs couldn't kill Ilara's mind completely. She began to notice the others. There were 14 girls in total. Azalea, Rose, Violet, Lily, a garden of drugged, beautiful teenagers. Some of them had been there for years. You could tell by their eyes. They were empty, glossy. They moved like marionettes whose strings were held by an invisible hand. One girl, a redhead named Camille, or Poppy, as she was called here, became Ilara's roommate. Camille was the daughter of a federal judge. She had been at Belle Reve for 6 months. Late at night, when the matrons were asleep and the effects of the tonic were wearing thin, Camille would whisper across the dark room, "It's not a school, Ilara." Camille breathed, her voice barely audible over the hum of the cicadas outside. "It's a store." "What do you mean?" Ilara asked, clutching her pillow. "The parties," Camille said. "The Saturday night socials. That's why they teach us to pour the wine. That's why they teach us to dance. They come in the big cars. The men from Baton Rouge. The men from the capital. They come to look at the flowers." Ilara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "My father, he wouldn't. He sent me here to learn etiquette." "Your father sent you here because you were an inconvenience," Camille said, her voice hard with a cynicism far beyond her years. "And Judge LeBlanc turned you into a commodity. Wait until Saturday. You'll see. They dress us up. They put diamonds on us." And then they bid. The Saturday night social was the centerpiece of Judge LeBlanc's operation. It was a grotesque parody of a debutante ball. The ballroom on the ground floor was opened. Chandeliers were lit, casting a golden glow over the peeling paint. A string quartet played Mozart. The air was thick with the smell of roasted pork and expensive bourbon. Ilara's first social was a descent into madness. She was bathed, perfumed with gardenia oil, and dressed in a silk gown that was cut lower than anything her mother would have allowed. Madame Delphine clasped a diamond necklace around her throat. "This is on loan," Delphine whispered, her breath smelling of peppermint. "Do not lose it, and do not disappoint the judge. Tonight, you are presenting yourself to the board of directors." Ilara was marched down the stairs with the other girls. At the bottom, the room was filled with men. Men in tuxedos, men in white suits, men she recognized from the newspapers. There was a state senator, there was the CEO of a railroad company, and there, holding a crystal glass of whiskey, was Judge LeBlanc, beaming like a proud father at a wedding. "Gentlemen," LeBlanc's voice boomed, "the garden is in full bloom tonight. May I present the new arrivals?" The girls were paraded through the room. They weren't allowed to speak unless spoken to. The men would approach them, touch their arms, inspect their teeth like they were buying horses. They made comments about their breeding and their temperament. "This one looks spirited," a fat man with a cigar said, blowing smoke in Ilara's face. He reached out and touched a lock of her hair. Ilara flinched. The man laughed. "I like a little fight. Makes the breaking more satisfying." LeBlanc walked over, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. "Magnolia is a special project, Senator. She requires a firm hand. But I assure you, the investment yields high returns." Ilara realized then that Camille was right. This wasn't a finishing school. It was a high-end brothel for the untouchable elite. A place where the laws of man and God were suspended, protected by the very people sworn to uphold them. The girls were the currency. Their bodies were the bribes that greased the wheels of politics in Louisiana. That night, Ilara wasn't sold. She was too new, still in the grooming phase. But she watched. She watched as Camille was led away by the senator toward the East Wing, a part of the house that was off limits. She watched the look in Camille's eyes, a dull, resigned terror. When Camille returned to their room hours later, she didn't speak. She took off her dress, folded it neatly, and crawled into bed. She was shivering. Ilara reached out to touch her, but Camille pulled away. "Don't," Camille whispered. "I'm not here. I'm not here." The horror of Belle Reve wasn't just the violation, it was the normalization of it. The next morning, there was a chapel service. Judge LeBlanc read from the Bible, preaching about purity and obedience. The senator sat in the front row, singing hymns. The cognitive dissonance was enough to shatter a mind, but Ilara Vance had something the other girls had lost. She had rage. The rage burned through the fog of the sedatives. She looked at Judge LeBlanc, preaching his sermon, and she didn't see a monster. She saw a target. She looked at the swamp outside the window, the endless, impassable green, and she didn't see a prison wall. She saw a chaotic, dangerous path, but a path nonetheless. She began to fake taking her medicine. She would hold the pill under her tongue and spit it out into the potted fern in the hallway. Clarity returned slowly. Her hands stopped shaking. Her mind sharpened. She started mapping the house. She counted the guards. She noted the shift changes. She realized that the only time the gate was open was during the storms, when the power flickered and the electric locks on the perimeter fence disengaged. And in Louisiana, in October, the storms always came. It was 2 weeks before Halloween when the radio in the kitchen, which Ilara overheard while serving tea to the guards, announced a tropical depression forming in the Gulf. It was heading straight for the Atchafalaya. The name of the storm was Hurricane Ella. Ilara went back to her room and woke Camille. "We're leaving," she whispered. Camille looked at her, eyes wide. "We can't. The swamp, the gators." "The gators are hungry," Ilara said, her voice hard. "But so is the judge. I'd rather take my chances with the animals that don't pretend to be men." She spent the next week recruiting. She couldn't take everyone. Some were too broken, some were too loyal to Madame Delphine, convinced that this was their only life. She chose 3 others. Camille, a girl named Violet, who had grown up on a farm and knew how to track, and a quiet girl named Rose, who had stolen a letter opener from the judge's desk and kept it sharpened under her mattress. The plan was madness. They would wait for the storm to hit. When the power went out, the alarms would be dead. They would slip out through the kitchen, make for the bayou, and try to find a boat. They had no map, no weapons except a letter opener, and they were wearing ball gowns. Halloween night arrived. The wind began to howl around the mansion, rattling the shutters like angry ghosts. The rain came down in sheets, turning the world gray. Inside, the Halloween masquerade was beginning. The men arrived in masks, Venetian carnival masks that hid their identities but not their cruelty. Judge LeBlanc was dressed as a king, complete with a velvet cape. He was drinking heavily, celebrating the storm. "Let the winds blow," he shouted, raising a toast. "We are safe in our fortress." But at 9 p.m., a bolt of lightning struck the main transformer down the road. The lights in Belle Rave flickered, buzzed, and died. The mansion was plunged into darkness. "Stay calm!" LeBlanc's voice rang out. "Get the candles!" In the confusion, Alara grabbed Camille's hand. Now! They moved like shadows, not the delicate flowers they were trained to be, but desperate creatures fighting for survival. They slipped out the side door of the ballroom, into the kitchen, and out into the storm. The noise outside was deafening. The wind screamed. The rain felt like gravel hitting their skin. They ran toward the tree line, their silk dresses instantly soaked, heavy, and dragging in the mud. "They'll see us!" Violet screamed over the wind. "Keep moving!" Ilara yelled. But they hadn't counted on the dogs. LeBlanc didn't just have guards. He had a pack of Caligula leopard dogs bred for hunting boar in the swamp. As the girls reached the edge of the bayou, a spotlight beam cut through the rain from the second-floor balcony. LeBlanc was there, holding a flashlight. "Run, little birds!" He laughed, his voice amplified by the wind. "Run. The sport is better when you run." He blew a whistle. The baying of the dogs erupted from the kennels. Ilara looked at the black water. It was churning, angry. "Into the water," she commanded. "Are you crazy?" Camille cried. "The scent!" Ilara grabbed her shoulders. "The water hides the scent. It's the only way." They plunged into the freezing, murky darkness of the Atchafalaya. The water was up to their chests. The bottom was slime and roots that grabbed at their ankles. They waited, gasping, as the dogs hit the tree line behind them. This was the start of the nightmare that would end with Ilara alone on a log, waiting for a savior who would turn out to be a pawn. But in that moment, in the dark water, she felt a strange, savage triumph. She was cold. She was terrified. But for the first time in months, she wasn't Magnolia, she was Ilara, and she was at war. The Atchafalaya does not fight you. It swallows you. That is the first rule of the basin. If you thrash, you sink. If you panic, you breathe water. If you scream, you simply announce your location to the things that hunt in the dark. For Ilara Vance and the three girls wading through the black, chest-deep mire of the bayou, the water was a living, malevolent entity. It was heavy with silt and rot, dragging at the heavy silk of their ball gowns like 1,000 cold hands. The storm above them had turned the world into a cacophony of violence. Rain fell not in drops but in sheets, hammering the surface of the swamp into a white froth. Thunder rattled the submerged roots of the cypress trees, vibrating through the water and into their bones. But the sound that drove them forward, the sound that cut through the roaring wind, was the baying of the Catahoula curs. These weren't domestic dogs. They were leopard dogs, bred in Louisiana to track wild hogs through this exact terrain. They were relentless, fearless, and they had the scent of expensive perfume and fear. "I can't," Rose gasped. She was the smallest of them, the quiet girl who had stolen the letter opener. Her dress, a heavy velvet number that Madame Delphine had chosen for its regal bearing, was now an anchor. "It's too heavy. Ilara, please." Ilara grabbed Rose's arm, her grip bruising. "Don't you stop. If you stop, they take you back to the quiet room. Do you hear me? Move." But the swamp has a way of separating the weak from the unlucky. As they scrambled over a submerged log, slick with algae, Rose's foot caught in a tangle of cypress knees. She lurched forward, her scream swallowed by a clap of thunder. The current, swollen by the floodwaters, seized her. There was no cinematic splashing, no flailing hand reaching up for help. One moment she was there, a pale shape in the rain. The next, the water simply folded over her. "Rose!" Violet screamed, turning back. "Leave her!" Ilara shouted, the cruelty of survival taking over. "She's gone! Keep moving!" They scrambled onto a small hammock of high ground. a muddy island infested with palmettos and fire ants. They were three now: Alara, Camille, and Violet. They collapsed in the mud, gasping for air that tasted of ozone and decay. Behind them, the flashlight beams of the pursuing guards danced through the trees like erratic lightning bugs. They were getting closer. Ilara could hear the men shouting, their voices distinct over the storm. "Find them!" That was the voice of the head guard, a brute named Thibodeau who enjoyed using a cattle prod on the girls who spilled wine. "The judge wants them alive." But he didn't say unharmed. Violet broke. The terror that had been fueling her adrenaline suddenly curdled into panic. "I can't do this," she sobbed, clawing at her muddy skirts. "I'm going to hide. I'm going to climb a tree." "Violet, no," Camille hissed. "The dogs will treat you like a raccoon. We have to stay in the water." "I'm not going back in there," Violet shrieked. She scrambled up the trunk of a massive live oak, her white dress stark against the dark bark. It was a fatal mistake. In the swamp, height doesn't make you safe. It makes you visible. A spotlight swept across the hammock. It caught Violet instantly, frozen halfway up the tree like a pinned moth. "Got one!" a voice roared. The crack of a rifle shot wasn't meant to kill. It was meant to terrify. The bullet splintered the bark inches from Violet's head. She screamed and lost her grip, tumbling 10 feet into the mud below. Before she could stand, the dogs were on her. Ilara and Camille watched from the cover of a dense palmetto thicket just 10 yards away. They watched the shadows of the dogs swarm over the girl in the white dress. They heard the snapping of jaws and the sounds of fabric tearing. Violet wasn't being eaten. The dogs were trained to hold, but she was being mauled into submission. Thibodeau stepped into the light, kicking the dogs away. He grabbed Violet by her hair, dragging her upright. She was limp, muddy, and broken. "Two left," he shouted into the rain. "Come out, darlings, or I let the dogs finish the job." Alara felt Camille's hand in hers. It was cold as ice. Camille, the girl who had cynically explained the store to Alara, who had seemed so hardened, was shaking so violently her teeth chattered. "He's going to catch us," Camille whispered. "Alara, he's going to catch us." "Not if we split up," Alara said, her mind working with a cold, detached logic. "They're focused on Violet. The noise covers us. You go west, toward the river channel. I'll go north." "I can't go alone," Camille pleaded. "You have to," Ilara said. She squeezed Camille's hand one last time, then pushed her away. "Run, Poppy, run!" Camille scrambled away into the darkness. Ilara waited a heartbeat, then slid back into the water on the opposite side of the island. She submerged herself up to her nose, drifting with the current, becoming just another piece of debris in the flood. She didn't know if Camille made it. She didn't know if Rose was dead. She only knew that she had to keep moving until her heart stopped or the sun came up. She drifted for hours. The storm eventually broke, leaving behind a silence that was even heavier than the thunder. The adrenaline faded, replaced by hypothermia. Her limbs stopped obeying her. Her mind began to fragment. She saw her mother's face in the Spanish moss. She saw Jesse, her mechanic boyfriend, reaching for her from the water, but when she reached back, his hand turned into a gator's snout. Finally, her body gave up. She washed up against the roots of a dead cypress tree, her dress snagged, her energy spent. This was where Beau Landry found her. We return now to that moment on the dock, the moment where salvation turned into betrayal. Beau Landry, the Cajun fisherman with a conscience, stood watching as Sheriff Earl Broussard closed the back door of the cruiser. He saw Ilara's face pressed against the glass, a mask of dull horror. "Sheriff," Beau said, shifting his weight, "that girl, she's hurt bad. She needs a doctor. Those cuts on her feet." "I got a first aid kit, Beau," Broussard said, leaning against the car door. He lit a cigarette, the flare of the match illuminating a face that was pouchy and tired, the face of a man who had sold his soul on an installment plan years ago. "You done good tonight. You found a lost bird, but birds carry diseases, you know. Best you forget you ever saw this one." He flicked a $20 bill onto the gravel. It landed in a puddle of muddy water. "For your gas," Broussard said. Beau looked at the money. He looked at the girl. He knew, with the certainty of a man who lived in a parish ruled by silence, that if he argued, he would be found floating face down in a crab trap by morning. He swallowed his honor, picked up the bill, and turned away. As the cruiser pulled away, Ilara didn't scream. She sat in the caged back seat, the smell of stale tobacco and gun oil filling her nose. She watched the back of the sheriff's head. "Please," she whispered. It was the first word she had spoken since the boat. Broussard looked at her in the rear-view mirror. His eyes weren't unkind. They were simply empty. "Now, Miss Magnolia," he said, using her slave name. "You know I can't let you go. The judge, he gets very upset when his inventory goes missing. He's got investors coming next week. Can't have empty shelves." "He's killing us," Ilara said. "Rose is dead. The dogs." Rose was clumsy, Broussard shrugged. "And Violet, well, Violet needed a lesson in obedience. You, though, you're the prize. The judge has a soft spot for the ones who fight. Says it sweetens the meat." He picked up the radio handset. "Dispatch, this is Unit 1. Inform the big house the package is secure. I'm bringing it home." The drive back to Belle Reve was a blur of passing trees and rain-slicked asphalt. When the iron gates loomed out of the mist, Ilara felt a physical weight press down on her chest. The gates groaned open. The limousine tracks from the night before were washed away, but the house remained, white and towering, a mausoleum for the living. Broussard parked at the front steps. The front door opened, and Madame Delphine stepped out. She was immaculate, her black dress crisp, her hair perfect. She held a large black umbrella, shielding herself from the last drizzles of the storm. She didn't look angry. She looked efficient. Broussard hauled Ilara out of the car. Her legs collapsed, and she fell onto the wet gravel. "She's a bit worse for wear, madame," Broussard said, tipping his hat. "Found her with a fisherman. Paid him off." "Good work, Earl," Delphine said. She looked down at Ilara. "Look at you. Look at that dress. Do you know how much French silk costs?" Ilara looked up. "I hope it was worth every penny," she spat, though her voice was weak. Delphine smiled. It was a terrifying, thin expression. "Oh, you will work off the debt, my dear, starting tonight." Delphine snapped her fingers. Two guards, Thibodeau and another man, stepped out from the shadows. They grabbed Ilara by the arms and dragged her up the stairs. But they didn't take her to the nursery. They didn't take her to the quiet room. They dragged her through the foyer, past the ballroom where the party had ended, and into the library. Sitting behind a massive mahogany desk was Judge Julien Leblanc. He was cleaning a shotgun with an oiled rag. He didn't look up when they entered. "Leave us," Leblanc said. Delphine and the guards retreated, closing the heavy oak doors. Ilara stood there, shivering, dripping muddy water onto the Persian rug. She waited for him to yell. She waited for him to strike her. Leblanc looked up. His face was flushed, his eyes bright with a strange, manic energy. "Do you know what happened to your friends, Magnolia?" Ilara stayed silent. "Rose drowned," Leblanc said, his voice conversational. "We found the body against the weir, a waste. And Violet will never walk without a limp again. The dogs took a liking to her calf muscle." He stood up and walked around the desk. He stopped inches from her. He smelled of brandy and gunpowder. "And Camille," he whispered. "Poor Camille. She almost made it to the highway, but she hesitated. She stopped to look back for you." Ilara's heart stopped. "Where is she?" "She's in the infirmary," Leblanc said. "We had to sedate her heavily. She was hysterical, but you made it all the way to the river. You survived the storm. You survived the dogs." He reached out and touched her face. His hand was warm, soft, the hand of a man who never did manual labor. "I underestimated you," Leblanc said. "I thought you were just another spoiled debutante. But you're a survivor, and that makes you dangerous. Dangerous things need to be kept in very secure cages." He leaned in close to her ear. "Or they need to be put to work. You see, the men who come here, they get bored with the crying. They get bored with the fear. They want a challenge. They want something wild." He pulled back, smiling. "Congratulations, Magnolia. You've just been promoted. No more etiquette lessons. No more tea parties. Tomorrow night, the governor is coming for a private dinner. And you are the main course." He pressed a button on his desk. The doors opened. "Take her to the White Room," he ordered Delphine. "Scrub her, paint her, and make sure she doesn't sleep." The White Room was not a euphemism. It was a sterile, tiled room in the East Wing, lit by harsh, fluorescent bulbs that hummed like angry hornets. There was no furniture, only a mattress on the floor and a drain in the center. For the next 24 hours, Ilara was subjected to a regime of psychological breaking that made the waterboarding look humane. They stripped her, scrubbed her skin with stiff brushes until she bled, then applied ointments that stung like fire. They forced her to sit under bright lights, listening to recordings of her father's voice, snippets of phone calls LeBlanc had recorded, talking about business deals, laughing, completely oblivious to his daughter's existence. "He sold you," the voice on the recording seemed to say. "He traded you for an oil lease." It was designed to sever the last tie she had to the outside world, to make her believe that no one was coming, that she belonged to Belle Rave. But LeBlanc had made a miscalculation. He thought that by stripping away hope, he would leave only obedience. He was wrong. When you strip away hope, you also strip away fear. A person with nothing to lose is the most dangerous weapon in the world. Sitting in the White Room, staring at the drain, Ilara Vance died. The girl who loved poetry, the girl who loved a mechanic named Jesse, the girl who wanted to be a writer, she dissolved, and in her place, something cold and hard crystallized. She stopped crying. She stopped shivering. She ate the food they shoved through the slot in the door. She drank the water. She let them paint her face and curl her hair. When Madame Delphine came to collect her for the governor's dinner, she expected a broken doll. She expected to have to drag the girl. Instead, Ilara stood up. She smoothed the skirt of the new dress, a red silk gown that looked like spilled blood. She looked Delphine in the eye. "Is my hair straight?" Ilara asked. Delphine blinked, surprised. "It is perfect." "Good," Ilara said. "Let's go." As she walked down the hallway, the sound of her heels clicking on the marble floor sounded like the ticking of a bomb. She wasn't walking to her execution. She was walking to her battlefield. She knew the governor. She had met him once at a garden party with her father. He was a vain man, a man who liked flattery, a man who liked to drink. And she knew something else. She knew where the judge kept his liquor, and she knew where the gardener kept the rat poison, the arsenic used to keep the vermin out of the azaleas. The dinner was held in the private dining room. Crystal glasses, silver platters, candlelight reflecting off the mahogany walls. The governor sat at the head of the table, his face flushed with wine. LeBlanc sat opposite him. "And here she is," LeBlanc announced as Ilara entered. "The jewel of the bayou." Ilara curtsied, a perfect, graceful dip. "Good evening, gentlemen." The governor clapped his hands. "My word, Julian, you were right. Stunning." "Pour the wine, Magnolia," LeBlanc commanded. Ilara moved to the sideboard. Her hands were steady. She picked up the decanter of vintage Bordeaux. She shielded the glass with her body as she poured. From the pocket of her dress, she slipped a small packet of white powder, stolen from the gardener's shed during a brief moment of unsupervised exercise in the yard weeks ago. A backup plan she had been saving for suicide, into the governor's glass. She didn't put it in LeBlanc's. Killing LeBlanc was too easy. She needed chaos. She needed the state to come crashing down on this place. She placed the glass in front of the governor. "To the south," Ilara said, her voice sweet as poison. "To the south," the governor roared and drained the glass. Ilara stepped back into the shadows. She watched. She waited. 10 minutes later, the governor dropped his fork. He clutched his throat. His face turned a violacious purple. "What is this?" LeBlanc stood up. "Governor." The governor convulsed, knocking the table over. Crystal shattered. The guards rushed in. "He's choking!" LeBlanc yelled. "Get the doctor!" In the chaos, no one watched the girl in the red dress. Ilara slipped out of the dining room. She didn't run for the door. She ran for the library. She needed matches. She found the judge's lighter on the desk. She grabbed a bottle of brandy from the shelf. She soaked the heavy velvet curtains. She soaked the Persian rug. She soaked the piles of ledgers that contained the names of every girl and every client. She flicked the lighter. The flame caught instantly. It raced up the curtains, hungry and bright. Ilara walked out of the library and locked the doors from the outside. She pocketed the key. The fire alarm finally began to ring, a shrill screaming sound that matched the chaos in her heart. Smoke began to fill the hallway. She walked to the staircase. She had to get the others. She had to get to the nursery. But as she reached the landing, she saw Madame Delphine standing at the top of the stairs. The older woman held a set of keys in one hand and a pistol in the other. "What have you done?" Delphine screamed, her composure finally shattering. "You little witch! You've destroyed everything!" "No," Alara said, looking up at her with eyes that reflected the growing flames. "I'm just finishing the lesson." Delphine raised the gun. "I will kill you right here." "Shoot me," Alara said, stepping forward. "Shoot me and burn with the house, or give me the keys and run. The fire is already in the walls, Delphine. The old wood, it's dry as tinder." Delphine hesitated. She looked at the smoke billowing from the library. She looked at the gun. She looked at the girl who had become a monster to defeat monsters. With a scream of frustration, Delphine threw the keys at Ilara's feet and ran. She ran like a coward, pushing past the confused guards, fleeing the empire she had helped build. Ilara grabbed the keys. She ran to the third floor. "Wake up!" she screamed, unlocking door after door. "Wake up! Fire! Get out!" The girls, groggy from the tonic, stumbled out. They coughed in the smoke. "Follow me!" Alara led them not to the front door, but to the servants' stairs at the back. They burst out into the cool night air. The rain had stopped. The moon was out. Behind them, the mansion of Belle Rêve was groaning. The windows of the library blew out, spewing orange flames into the night sky. It was beautiful, but the night wasn't over. As the girls huddled on the lawn watching their prison burn, a figure emerged from the smoke near the front entrance. It was Judge LeBlanc. He was singed, his white suit blackened with soot. He was coughing, but he was alive, and he was holding the shotgun. He saw them. He saw Ilara standing in the center of the group, the red dress glowing in the firelight. "You!" he roared, raising the weapon. "You ungrateful whore! I made you!" Ilara didn't flinch. She stood her ground. "You made me!" she shouted back. "So come and take what you made!" LeBlanc cocked the gun. But before he could pull the trigger, a sound erupted from the tree line, a deep, guttural roar. It wasn't a gator, it was an airboat engine. Lights blinded them. A massive fan boat skidded onto the wet grass, sliding sideways. Standing on the deck, holding a hunting rifle, was Beau Landry. And behind him, stepping off the boat with a grim determination, was a young man in grease-stained coveralls. Jesse. And behind them, armed with shotguns and tire irons, were a dozen men from the bayou, fishermen, crabbers, the people the bloodline ignored. "Drop it, Judge," Beau yelled. LeBlanc turned, swinging the shotgun toward the boat. A single shot rang out. It didn't come from Beau, it came from the shadows of the burning porch. Sheriff Broussard stepped into the light, his service revolver smoking. LeBlanc stumbled back. He looked at his chest, where a red flower was blooming on his white shirt. He looked at Broussard with shock. "Earl?" he wheezed. "You went too far, Julian," Broussard said, his voice trembling. "You poisoned the governor. That brings the feds. I can't cover for the feds." LeBlanc fell to his knees. He looked at the burning house. He looked at Ilara, and then he fell face forward into the mud. The king of the swamp was dead. The girls stood in silence, watching the fire consume the last of the beautiful dream. The roof collapsed with a crash that sounded like applause. Ilara walked over to Jesse. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her smoky hair. She didn't cry. She held him, but her eyes were over his shoulder, watching the flames. She saw the sheriff holstering his gun, already composing the lie he would tell the press. She saw Beau Landry looking at the ground, ashamed of his delay. She realized then that the fire hadn't cleansed everything. The house was gone, but the rot was deep in the soil. The fire at Belle Rêve burned for 3 days. It was fed by the heart pine structure of the antebellum mansion, the varnish on the antique furniture, and the library full of secrets that Ilara Vance had ignited. By the time the state fire marshal from Baton Rouge arrived, navigating his truck through the muddy ruts of the driveway, the beautiful dream was nothing but a blackened chimney stack rising out of a pile of ash, looking like a charred finger accusing the sky. But the fire was the easy part to manage. Fire is a natural disaster. It can be explained. It can be ensured. The bodies were harder. In the chaotic hours before dawn, while the embers were still glowing orange against the swamp mist, Sheriff Earl Broussard went to work. He didn't act like a lawman. He acted like a crime scene cleaner. He ordered his deputies, men who knew better than to ask questions, to cordon off the area. He kept the Cajun militia, Beau Landry and Jesse, at gunpoint near the levee, threatening them with federal kidnapping charges if they didn't disappear back into the bayou. "You take the boy," Broussard told Beau, gesturing to Jesse, who was trying to reach Ilara. "You take him deep, Beau. If I see him in this parish again, I'll find a drop gun and a reason to use it. Go." Ilara watched them leave. She stood wrapped in a firefighter's blanket, the red silk dress ruined, her face smeared with soot. She saw the look in Jesse's eyes, a desperate, shattering heartbreak. He wanted to save her. He had come into the fire for her, but he was a mechanic, and she was an oil heiress. And in 1958, Louisiana, that gap was wider than the Mississippi River. As the airboat faded into the dark, she knew she wouldn't see him again. The sheriff was making sure of that. Then came the narrative. Broussard met the first wave of reporters at the main gate. He took off his hat, wiped his brow, and looked every bit the weary, grieving public servant. Tragedy, Broussard told the press, his voice thick with emotion. A gas leak in the kitchen. Terrible accident. The judge, hero that he was, tried to save the girls. He died defending his school. And the governor, the most powerful man in the state, lying dead on the dining room floor with a face the color of an eggplant. A stroke, Broussard said, lowering his voice respectfully, brought on by the shock of the fire. He was dining with the judge, discussing education reform, a patriot to the end. It was a lie so audacious, so immense, that it had to be true. Who would challenge it? The girls? They were drugged, traumatized teenagers labeled as troubled by their own parents. The militia? They were swamp rats with no credibility. The truth was buried under the weight of the bloodline. The cleanup was efficient. The survivors were separated immediately. They weren't taken to a hospital where doctors might document the signs of abuse, the malnutrition, or the scars from the dogs. They were taken to private holding rooms in the parish jail under the guise of protective custody until their families could collect them. Elara's father arrived 2 days later. He didn't come in the family limousine. He came in a nondescript sedan driven by his lawyer. When he walked into the holding cell, he didn't run to hug her. He didn't cry. He stood by the door, looking at his daughter as if she were a failed investment. "You burned it down," Clayton Vance said. "It wasn't a question." "I did," Elara replied. Her voice was raspy from smoke inhalation, but it didn't tremble. "And I'd do it again." "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Clayton hissed, stepping closer. "The governor is dead. The judge is dead. The contracts. The alliances." "The contracts." Elara laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "That's what you're worried about. Not that your friend was selling us. Not that he fed Rose to the dogs." Clayton's face hardened. "Rose died in the fire. That's the official report. And you. You're going to be very, very quiet, Elara, because if you aren't, there are places worse than Belle Rave. Places with padded walls where no one listens to a hysterical girl who imagines conspiracies. It was the ultimate threat. The asylum. In the 1950s, a father could commit his daughter with a single signature. Elara looked at him, and she realized the war wasn't over. It had just changed battlefields. "I'll be quiet," she lied. "Just take me home." She returned to New Orleans, but not to her life. The Elara Vance who loved poetry and jazz was gone. In her place was a ghost who haunted the family mansion. She spent her days in her room, staring at the ceiling, replaying the sound of the dogs and the smell of the smoke. But she kept her ears open. She learned the fate of the others through the whispers of the servants and the society pages. Camille, Poppy, didn't die in the fire, but she didn't survive it either. She was pulled from the infirmary by firefighters screaming about the men in masks. Her family, a prominent legal dynasty, swiftly committed her to St. Dymphna's sanitarium. She was subjected to electroshock therapy to cure her delusions. She spent the rest of her life staring out a window, drooling, unable to remember her own name, let alone the crimes of Judge LeBlanc. Violet, the girl mauled by the dogs, was married off 3 months later to a cousin in Alabama. A quiet wedding. She walked down the aisle with a heavy limp, her veil covering the scars on her face. She birthed 4 children and never spoke a word to any of them about where she had been in the autumn of 1958. The silence of the South closed over the case like duckweed over a pond. The coroner ruled the governor's death natural causes. The fire was ruled accidental. Sheriff Broussard retired a year later, buying a large cattle ranch with money that had no paper trail. But Elara had stolen something from the library before she burned it, not the ledgers. Those were too heavy. She had taken a single photograph from the judge's desk, a black and white photo of a hunting trip from 1955. In it, Judge LeBlanc stood next to her father, the governor, and 3 other senators. They were smiling, holding shotguns, and at their feet, bound and gagged, were not deer, but 3 young women in white dresses, looking at the camera with eyes full of terror. It was insurance. Elara waited. She waited until she turned 21 and gained access to a small trust fund left by her grandmother. She waited until the bruises on her soul had scabbed over into armor. On the night of her 21st birthday, she didn't have a party. She packed a single suitcase. She took the photograph from its hiding place inside the lining of her jewelry box. She walked into her father's study. Clayton Vance was older now, the stress of the cover-up having turned his hair white. He looked up from his whiskey. "Going somewhere?" he asked. Elara placed the photograph on his desk, face up. Clayton froze. The color drained from his face. "I'm leaving, Daddy," Elara said. "I'm taking my money. And I'm going to New York. If you try to stop me, if you try to commit me, if you send anyone to find me, copies of this photo go to the New York Times, the FBI, and every gossip columnist from here to Richmond." Clayton stared at the photo, the evidence of his complicity, the proof that he was a monster. "You wouldn't," he whispered. "It would ruin us. It would ruin you." "I'm already ruined," Elara said. "You saw to that. Now I'm just negotiating the severance package." She walked out of the house, out of the Garden District, and boarded a train at Union Station. As the train crossed the trestle over the swamp, she looked down at the black water one last time. She didn't see a prison anymore. She saw a graveyard. Elara Vance disappeared. In New York, a woman named Eleanor Vane began writing for a small, radical newspaper. She wrote about corruption. She wrote about the abuse of women in institutions. She wrote with a fury that scared her editors. She never married. She never had children. She lived alone in a walk-up apartment full of books and cigarette smoke. Decades passed. The South changed. Segregation ended. The oil boom went bust. The men in the photograph died, one by one. Sheriff Broussard died of cancer. Her father died of a heart attack. In 2005, after Hurricane Katrina ravaged New Orleans, the floodwaters receded to reveal things that had been buried for a long time. A young journalist digging into the history of corruption in Louisiana found a reference to a fire at a girls' school in an old police file that hadn't been purged. He tracked down the land records. He tracked down the legends of the ghost of the bayou. And finally, he tracked down Eleanor Vane. She was an old woman now, her hands gnarled by arthritis, but her eyes were still the same, sharp, unbroken. She sat in her apartment, listening to the young man ask about Belle Rave. He asked if the stories were true, if the judge really sold the girls, if the governor really died there. Eleanor looked at him. She thought about Rose, drowning in the dark. She thought about Camille, lobotomized in a white room. She thought about Jesse, the boy she had left on the levee, who she later learned had died in Vietnam, fighting a war for a country that didn't care about him. It wasn't a school, she told the journalist, her voice raspy with age. And it wasn't a tragedy, it was a business model. She reached into her desk drawer and pulled out the photograph. The edges were yellowed, but the image was clear. "You want the truth?" she asked. "The truth is that the South didn't lose the war because of soldiers. It lost because it rotted from the inside. We were the rot. We were the daughters they threw away to keep the party going." The documentary ends not with a courtroom gavel, because there never was one. It ends with a drone shot of the site where Belle Reve once stood. The ruins are gone now, swallowed completely by the Atchafalaya. The cypress trees have grown over the foundation. The azaleas have gone wild, choking the undergrowth with brilliant, toxic color. The water is still, black, and reflective. If you go there today, the locals will tell you not to go near Dead Man's Island after dark. They say you can hear music, Mozart played on a string quartet. They say you can hear the clink of crystal glasses. But if you listen closely past the wind and the cicadas, you don't hear music. You hear the sound of silk tearing. You hear the splash of a body hitting the water. The swamp remembers. The mud holds the shape of the things it buried. And while the men who built Belle Reve believed they could wash their hands of the sin, they forgot the most important lesson of the bayou. Water levels rise, and eventually everything floats to the top. The screen fades to black, leaving only the sound of a single match being struck, followed by the roar of a consuming fire.